For many people outside Central America, El Salvador was, for years, little more than a small name on the map, a country that surfaced in headlines only when there was political turmoil, violence, or some diplomatic shock that briefly drew the world's attention. But there is another reason that name has haunted police, investigators, and immigrant communities in the United States for decades. It is tied to the rise of one of the most notorious gangs in the modern world, MS-13. Today, when people speak about MS-13, they think of mutilated bodies, ruthless killings, human trafficking routes, terrified neighborhoods, and young lives dragged into organized violence. But the most disturbing thing about MS-13 is not simply what it became, it is how it began. Because this organization did not start as a machine built for terror, it began with people fleeing a war. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, El Salvador descended into civil war. In the wake of political upheaval across Latin America, and under the long shadow of military dictatorship, the country collapsed into a brutal internal conflict that would last for years. As in most wars, the people who suffered most were not the men in office or the men in uniform. It was ordinary civilians, caught between armed factions, political suspicion, poverty, and death. And tens of thousands fled. Alongside refugees from Guatemala, Nicaragua, and elsewhere in Central America, Salvadorans poured into the United States carrying an invisible burden: grief, rage, trauma, and a sense of permanent dislocation. Between the early 1980s and the 1990s, the Salvadoran population in the US surged dramatically. That was not simply a shift in migration, it was a social shockwave. But the America they arrived in was not the sanctuary many had imagined. Large numbers settled in Los Angeles, in some of the poorest and most violent neighborhoods in the city, places already scarred by gang conflict, deprivation, and racial tension. Young Salvadorans growing up there were not only trying to adapt to a new country, they were trying to survive it. They were bullied at school, marginalized at work, looked down upon because of where they came from, and treated as easy targets on the street. In that kind of environment, banding together was almost instinctive. It was not ideology at first, it was self-preservation, and that is the first soil in which MS-13 took root. At the beginning, it was simply a group of young Salvadorans in Los Angeles trying to protect their own. They needed a name, an identity, a sense of belonging. MS came from Mara Salvatrucha, while 13 was tied to local street identity and territory. Even the name carried a combustible mix of exile, pride, anger, and defiance. They developed hand signs, symbols, and a street code strong enough to stand against other gangs around them. At first glance, that origin almost sounds understandable, a vulnerable community forming a shield against abuse. But in a city like Los Angeles at that time, the line between defense and aggression did not stay intact for long. A group formed to protect its own quickly became a group willing to lash out at everyone else. Each fight, each retaliation, each violent confrontation pushed it further away from its original purpose. Then the circle widened. Refugees and migrants from other Central American countries joined. Men shaped by civil conflict, men who knew weapons, intimidation, and the logic of kill or be killed became part of the same world. The children of exile met the ghosts of war, and MS-13 began to change. It was no longer simply a tight knot of young men trying not to be crushed. It was becoming something harder, more organized, and more dangerous. It began to understand the power of fear. By the second half of the 1980s, the streets of Los Angeles were seeing near-daily clashes between MS-13 and rival gangs. Violence spread from one area to another, then across state lines as communities moved and networks expanded. What had started as a survival mechanism now had structure, hierarchy, territory, and ambition. What makes this part of the story so dark is that many of those young members probably did not believe they were creating a monster. They believed they were living by the only rule that made sense in the world around them: strike first or be broken, be more feared or be erased. On the street, morality erodes quickly. Pain does not automatically create compassion. Sometimes it creates only a new form of cruelty. And that is the deepest stain in the history of MS-13. It was born out of real suffering, real displacement, and real injustice. But instead of remaining a means of defense, it chose to turn pain into power. What had once looked like shelter became menace. What had once claimed to protect a community slowly became a nightmare hanging over that same community. MS-13 is often described as one of the most feared gangs in America, but the truth is more unsettling than that. It did not appear out of nowhere. It was built piece by piece, from the wreckage of war, from neglected neighborhoods, from boys who stopped believing society had any place for them at all. And once violence became a language, once loyalty was measured in blood, once terror began to produce status, the question was no longer how MS-13 was born. The question was how far it could go once it realized fear itself was power. In 1992, El Salvador's 12-year civil war formally came to an end. On paper, peace had arrived. In reality, very little had been repaired. For many Salvadorans living in the United States, the war might have faded from the homeland, but its consequences remained lodged in immigrant communities, gang structures, and the lives of those who had grown up in between two broken worlds. When the conflict ended, the United States saw an opening to take a harder line on immigration and crime. By 1996, stricter laws allowed the deportation of non-citizens convicted of offenses carrying prison sentences of a year or more. In a relatively short time, tens of thousands were removed and sent back to Central America. Among them were large numbers of gang members, including men tied to MS-13. On the surface, it looked like a clean and forceful solution: remove violent offenders and reduce gang influence on American streets, restore order. But beneath that logic sat one of the darkest turning points in the rise of MS-13. Because the United States did not merely deport individuals, it inadvertently exported an entire gang model. The cruel irony was that many of those deported were no longer meaningfully rooted in El Salvador. They had left as children. Some had grown up almost entirely in Los Angeles. Many spoke better English than Spanish. They understood American gang codes more than they understood the social reality of the country they were being sent back to. So when they landed in El Salvador, they were not really returning home. They were being dropped into a place that felt foreign, unstable, poor and unforgiving, a country where they had few ties, little support, and almost no lawful path forward. And in that environment, the only thing many of them recognized was the gang. And that is where MS-13 entered a new phase. If Los Angeles was the birthplace, El Salvador became the reconstruction site. The uprooted began rebuilding the organization with greater discipline and scale. They established chains of command, distributed influence, reconnected with contacts in the United States, and gradually transformed MS-13 from a street gang into a transnational criminal network. This was no longer just about fights on corners or sudden territorial clashes. From this point on, MS-13 operated more like a system, able to recruit, expand, profit, communicate across borders, and survive pressure. Its internal structure reportedly became more formal, even involving a so-called Council of Nine to divide authority and shape strategy. Branches in the US and Central America were no longer simply scattered groups carrying the same name. They became part of a broader web. Local leaders controlled neighborhoods, migrant routes, criminal markets, and enforcement. Drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, contract killings, extortion, and human trafficking all became part of the machinery. What made MS-13 especially dangerous was the way it fed on the most vulnerable communities around it. The organization needed fresh recruits constantly. For minors, entry could begin with a simple but devastating principle: commit something irreversible. Once a child has beaten someone, robbed someone, or taken part in violence, the road back becomes harder. Fear of the police is one thing. But the deeper trap is psychological. The sense that you have already crossed a line and no longer belong in ordinary life. For adults, entry was harsher still. Former members who escaped have said that leaving MS-13 is not like resigning from a group. It is more like carrying a death sentence for the rest of your life. The initiation rituals were not just acts of intimidation. They were acts of dehumanization. New recruits could be ordered to assault or even kill a stranger as proof of commitment. Men would then endure prolonged beatings from other gang members without complaint. For women, the violence often took a different form: coerced sex with multiple members as part of initiation. These rituals did not simply test loyalty. They destroyed dignity, erased boundaries, and pulled new recruits into the gang through humiliation, fear, and complicity. For years, tattoos were one of the clearest visible markers of MS-13. The letters MS, faces covered in ink, bodies turned into declarations of allegiance. But once law enforcement began using those same markings to identify and track members, the gang adapted. It reduced conspicuous tattooing, especially on the face, and became more cautious about external signs of membership. That shift mattered. It showed investigators they were no longer dealing with a gang that only relied on brute swagger. They were facing an organization capable of learning, adjusting, and surviving. One of the bleakest aspects of MS-13's operations was human trafficking and the sexual exploitation of minors. This was not simply another revenue stream. It was one of the gang's most grotesque forms of control, turning desperation into profit. In 2009, police in Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia moved simultaneously against 9 child prostitution sites and rescued numerous underage girls, most between 12 and 14 years old. All 9 locations were linked to MS-13. From that operation, authorities arrested Rivas Amaya, a young gang figure in Virginia who was only 21 at the time and reportedly known by the nickname The Killer. His case revealed a chilling pattern. Girls had been lured from El Salvador and other Central American countries with promises of a better future in the United States. Once there, their documents were taken. They were raped, drugged, and pushed into brothels as commodities. Victims described rules imposed on them with cold brutality. Never reveal your real name. Never reveal your real age. Pregnancy makes you useless. Disobedience can get you killed. They were expected to see multiple clients a night while the money went elsewhere. This was no longer street crime in the narrow sense. It was a business model built on the destruction of children. For law enforcement, arrests like these were important victories. For the public, they offered proof that the state could still intervene. But for MS-13, losing one node in the network did not mean the network itself was broken. And for the victims, rescue did not mean restoration. Many were left with physical injuries, severe trauma, drug dependency, deportation, or a future trapped inside support systems too thin to repair what had been done to them. That is where the true nature of MS-13 becomes impossible to ignore. It is not just a gang that kills. It is a structure capable of pulling in the young, or the poor, the displaced, and the unprotected, and then binding them with violence, sex, drugs, shame, and fear. The greatest danger was never simply the number of gang members. It was the fact that MS-13 had become a system capable of reproducing itself. And once a system like that takes root in places shaped by poverty, migration, instability, and social collapse, crackdowns can hit the branches without ever reaching the roots. By the late 2000s and into the 2010s, MS-13 was no longer just a name buried in police files or known only inside old immigrant neighborhoods in Los Angeles. It had become a symbol large enough to appear in presidential speeches, federal investigations, and international headlines. It was no longer a local gang problem. It had become a transnational security problem. In 2008, the FBI reported that MS-13 activity had been identified in 42 U.S. states, with global membership estimated at around 50,000. By October 2017, the U.S. Department of Justice had formally designated the gang as a high-priority target. That alone said something significant. MS-13 was no longer being treated as a fragmented street threat. It was being viewed as an organized network with reach, adaptability, and the ability to instill fear far beyond its original neighborhoods. One of the places that turned MS-13 into a public obsession in the United States was Long Island. In the year before Donald Trump's speech there on 28 July 2017, the area saw a series of killings linked to the gang. The victims were often teenagers. Many were brutally attacked before death. Some bodies were severely mutilated. The violence was not only about eliminating targets, it was also about sending a message. It functioned as theater, punishment, intimidation, spectacle. One of the most notorious examples came in September 2016, when the bodies of 2 female high school students were found after they had reportedly argued online with MS-13 members. That detail alone was enough to make the case especially chilling. In the gang's world, a digital dispute could become a death sentence in the real one. The boundary between insult and execution had all but disappeared. When Trump spoke on Long Island, he called for the United States and Central American governments to work together to destroy MS-13. It was one of the clearest public signs that the gang had entered the language of national security. But if anyone expected the organization to shrink under the pressure of that kind of attention, the aftermath suggested otherwise. Only about a week after that speech, in August 2017, gunmen linked to MS-13 attacked Roosevelt Hospital in Guatemala City. 7 people were killed and 13 others injured. The symbolism was extraordinary. A hospital is meant to be one of the last protected spaces in any society, a place for treatment, recovery, and survival. Yet even there, MS-13 demonstrated that if it wanted to strike, it could drag violence straight into the heart of a place built to save lives. Public anger in Guatemala surged. Authorities intensified the hunt. By October 2017, they arrested Angel Gabriel Reyes Marin, known as White Angel Gabriel, then 28 years old. He was considered the leader of MS-13 in Guatemala, had reportedly been arrested before in 2004 and escaped prison the same year. Authorities believed he was linked to at least 287 murders in the country. It was the sort of arrest that should have looked decisive. A major figure, a major operation, a major victory. But that is one of the recurring illusions in the fight against MS-13, the belief that removing one powerful man can cripple the whole structure. The problem is that MS-13 does not function like a body with a single brain. It behaves more like a distributed network. Remove one node and the system suffers, but it does not die. One arrest can destabilize a territory. It cannot erase the conditions that produced dozens more men willing to take that place. In Central America, the gang's brutality was intensified by its war with a historic rival, MS-13, and also known as the 18th Street Gang. Like MS-13, MS-13 had deep roots in Central American immigrant communities and expanded significantly after the deportation era. Between them, the 2 organizations fought for neighborhoods, extortion territory, smuggling routes, symbolic dominance, and the right to decide who lived in fear. One of the most horrifying episodes came inside Santa Ana prison in El Salvador on January 5, 2017. There, a confrontation involving MS-13 inmates and prison guards escalated into a large-scale battle with MS-13 prisoners. Hundreds of inmates attacked one another with anything they could turn into weapons. Guards reportedly fled in fear and watched from a distance, unable to regain control. When it ended, 21 prisoners had been decapitated and dismembered, while hundreds more were injured. This was no ordinary prison riot. It was the image of a state losing command of its own cage and leaving that space to become a battlefield run by gangs. And yet, even after bloodshed on that scale, there was no real victory. In 2013, MS-13 and MARA-18 had entered a truce that helped lower murder rates in some places. But only a year later, disputes over interests and power shattered it. At one point in El Salvador, the gang war drove average daily killings to around 16 people a day. Later, when it suited both sides, ceasefires emerged again. In that world, human life was not a moral limit. It was a bargaining chip. That is why the struggle against MS-13 still feels unfinished. The United States has worked with Central American governments. Raids have continued. Leaders have been arrested. Trafficking operations have been disrupted. Individual branches have been weakened. But at the same time, MS-13 has kept recruiting young people, kept exploiting migration routes, and kept extending its reach into new places, including Mexico. Violence continues to regenerate because the raw material that feeds it remains in place: poverty, broken families, instability, abandoned neighborhoods, and young people who no longer believe in any legitimate future. MS-13 is a gang, yes, but calling it only a gang risks missing what sustains it. It is also the final product of overlapping failures: the failure of war, the failure of social protection, the failure of migration policy, the failure of state authority, and the failure to shield the vulnerable before violence recruits them first. It survives on blood, certainly, but knives and guns are not the only reason it endures. Now, what truly keeps it alive is a wider landscape of despair, one in which fear is profitable, belonging can be weaponized, and hopelessness makes almost any structure of power feel better than none at all. So yes, arresting a kingpin matters, closing a trafficking ring matters, crushing one gang cell matters, but all of it, however necessary, remains a form of emergency response if the machine producing uprooted, frightened, disposable young people is still running underneath. And that may be the most unsettling question in the entire story of MS-13. Not simply how to destroy MS-13, but whether another MS-13 will emerge so long as the world that made it is still there.